Clara Mende woke up that morning the same way she woke up every morning, tired before the day had even started. She lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling of her small apartment. The paint was peeling near the window. The pipes in the wall made their usual noise. Somewhere in the next room, her mother coughed softly in her sleep. Clara listened until the coughing stopped, then she got up. She made 2 cups of tea. She drank hers standing at the kitchen sink, watching the street below. A man walked his dog. A woman in a yellow coat hurried past. The city was already moving, already busy, already full of people going somewhere. Clara finished her tea, set the cup in the sink, and got dressed for work. She had been a waitress at Harrington's for almost 3 years. Harrington's was not the kind of restaurant where people went just to eat. It was the kind of place where people went to be seen. The lighting was warm and golden. The chairs were upholstered in deep green velvet. The tablecloths were white and pressed flat without a single wrinkle. Everything about it said, "This place is for people who matter." Clara did not feel like someone who mattered, but she was good at her job, and the tips, on a good night, were enough to cover the cost of her mother's medicine. That was enough of a reason to keep showing up. She tied her apron in the back hallway, the same way she always did, and went out onto the floor. The Friday dinner crowd at Harrington's was always the same crowd, just in different combinations. Business people celebrating deals, couples marking anniversaries, old friends reconnecting over expensive wine. Clara moved between the tables quietly, refilling glasses, placing dishes, remembering which guest had asked for no salt and which one had a nut allergy. She was good at remembering things. She was good at being invisible. Table 7 was Gerald Hartwell's table. Gerald Hartwell came every Friday. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and silver hair that he wore swept back from his forehead. He was in his late 50s and carried himself the way very wealthy men sometimes do, as if the room had been arranged for his comfort before he arrived. He was not rude, exactly. He was simply a man who had grown so accustomed to having things go his way that it had stopped occurring to him that there was any other way they could go. Tonight he had brought 6 colleagues. They were celebrating. Clara could tell from the moment she approached the table. The laughter was louder than usual. The orders were larger. The mood was the particular kind of festive that comes from a very large amount of money changing hands in the right direction. She took their orders. She brought their drinks. She smiled the smile she had practiced until it required no effort at all. She went back to the kitchen. "Table 7 again?" Sophia asked her, leaning against the counter. Sophia had been at Harrington's for 5 years and had an opinion about everything. "Table 7 again," Clara said. Sophia shook her head sympathetically and went back to her own section. It happened during the main course. Clara was refilling the water glasses at table 7 when Gerald Hartwell leaned back in his chair and looked across the room. His gaze landed on the piano near the fireplace, a large, beautiful instrument that Harrington's kept more as decoration than anything else. It sat in the corner, polished and perfectly tuned, but rarely played. Sometimes, on special evenings, the restaurant brought in a musician. Most nights, the piano simply stood there, silent and gleaming under the soft light. Gerald smiled. It was the smile of a man who had just thought of something he found amusing. "You know what would be fun?" he said to the table. He did not lower his voice. "I'll bet our waitress here cannot play a single note on that thing." His colleagues laughed. One of them, a man with a red face and a loosened tie, said, "Go on then, Gerald." Gerald looked up at Clara. She was standing very still, the water pitcher in her hand. "Here's what I'll do," he said, speaking to her now with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to making offers that others accepted. "You go over there and play something on that piano, anything at all, and I'll double whatever tip I was planning to leave you tonight. I'm being generous." He smiled again. "But I'm guessing you don't even know where to sit." The table laughed. Clara looked at him. She did not look away, and she did not look down, and she did not smile. She simply looked at him for a moment with an expression that was very calm and very steady. Then she said, "Please give me 1 minute. I need to speak with the manager." She walked away before anyone at the table could say another word. She found James, the maitre d', near the service corridor at the back of the restaurant. James was a careful, precise man who kept Harrington's running with the quiet efficiency of someone who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. Clara spoke to him quietly and quickly. She told him that she had studied classical piano at the Chicago Conservatory of Music. She told him she had been on a full scholarship. She told him she had left before finishing her degree because her mother had become ill and the bills had been more than she could manage. She told him she had not played in 6 years. She told him she would like to play tonight if he would allow it. James looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who paid attention to faces, and something in Clara's face told him that this was not a small thing she was asking. "Play whatever you like," he said. "Take as long as you need." Clara nodded once and walked back toward the dining room. She did not notice Sophia standing in the hallway behind her, close enough to have heard every word. But Sophia had heard, and Sophia, quietly and without making a fuss, began moving through the restaurant, pausing at one table, then another, leaning down and saying softly, "You may want to pay attention." Clara crossed the dining room without looking at table 7. She sat down at the Steinway the way a person sits down at something they have known their whole life, not with ceremony, not with hesitation, but with the simple ease of returning to a familiar place after a long time away. She adjusted the bench. She placed her hands on her lap for just a moment and was still. The restaurant did not go quiet all at once. It tilted into quiet the way a room does when something shifts in the air and people sense it before they understand it. Voices lowered. Cutlery rested against plates. A woman at the table nearest the window turned to look. Clara placed her hands on the keys. She played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It is one of the most difficult pieces in all of classical piano music. It begins quietly, almost gently, with a single melodic line that sounds, at first, like a question. Then it builds, slowly at first. With careful patience, gathering weight and feeling the way a river gathers water from 100 small streams, until it becomes something much larger than where it started. Clara played from memory. There was no sheet music. Her hands moved across the keys with certainty and with feeling, not the mechanical certainty of a machine repeating something it has been programmed to do, but the living certainty of someone who knows a piece of music so deeply that it has become part of them. At table 7, the laughter had stopped. Grald Hartwell quotes, wine glass was still raised halfway between the table and his mouth. It stayed there for a full minute before he seemed to realize it and set it down. Around the restaurant, things stopped. A man in the middle of a sentence forgot what he was saying. A woman who had been looking at her phone placed it face down on the table without looking away from the piano. The waiter who had been walking toward a table near the window stopped walking and simply stood still, a plate in each hand, listening. The music moved through the room the way music sometimes does when it is played by someone who means it, not as sound that fills the air, but as something that seems to reach inside the people hearing it and press gently on something they had not expected to feel. The piece was 8 minutes long. For 8 minutes, no one in Harrington said a word. When Clara lifted her hands from the keys and the last note faded, there was a pause. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was the kind of pause that says more than words do. The pause of a room full of people who have just experienced something and have not yet found the language for it. Then the applause began. It started at the table closest to the piano and moved outward like a wave. By the time it reached the back of the restaurant, people were on their feet. All 40 guests in Harrington were standing. Some of them were clapping. Some of them were simply standing very still, as though sitting back down immediately would be the wrong thing to do. Clara sat at the piano for a moment after the music ended. She was not performing stillness. She simply needed it. 6 years is a long time to keep something locked away inside yourself, and letting it out, even once, even here, in a restaurant full of strangers, takes something out of you that is also, in the same moment, given back. Then she stood, she smoothed her apron, she turned and faced the room. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not the face of someone who had won something. It was something quieter and more honest than that. The face of someone who has, after a very long time, remembered who they are. She walked back to table 7. Gerald Hartwell did not say anything for a moment. He looked at her differently than he had looked at her before, not as a waitress, not as someone whose name he had not bothered to learn, but as a person. As a specific, particular person who had just done something that had moved him, and he was old enough and honest enough to admit it. "How long did you play?" he asked. "From the age of 7, Clara said, "until I was 28. "What happened at 28? She told him. She told him about the scholarship, about the conservatory, about her mother's illness and the cost of the hospital bills, and the way one emergency had led to another, until the music had simply been the thing she could not afford to keep. She said it plainly, without looking for sympathy, the way a person states facts they have already made their peace with. Gerald listened. Not politely, actually listened, in the way that people rarely do when they are powerful and accustomed to being the one speaking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out a pen and a small card. He wrote something on the back of it. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. "I chair a foundation," he said. "We fund musicians who had to stop for reasons that had nothing to do with talent. There is a grant committee meeting next Tuesday. I would like you to be there." Clara looked at the card. She looked at it for a long time. "I still have 4 tables to finish tonight," she said. Something crossed Gerald's face. It might have been surprise. It might have been respect. It was a little of both. "Of course," he said, "Tuesday then." In the weeks that followed, 3 people who had been in Harrington that Friday evening made a point of reaching out. A music journalist wrote a short piece about what she had witnessed. A woman in a white apron playing Chopin for a room full of strangers who had not expected to be moved and were moved anyway. She wrote about the way the restaurant had gone quiet, and the standing ovation, and the look on the waitress's face at the end. A professor from the DePaul University Music Department called Harrington and asked if they could pass along a message to the woman who had played the piano. The message was that if she was ever interested in completing her studies, they would like to speak with her. A woman who had been dining alone at a corner table that night, no one knew her name. She had paid her bill and left quietly, wrote a letter to the restaurant. She said that she had not cried in almost 2 years, and that something about the music that evening had broken something open in her that needed to be broken open. She said thank you. Clara attended the grant committee meeting on Tuesday. She sat in a room with 8 people, some of them musicians themselves, and she told her story one more time. This time, the story had an audience that was listening for a different reason. They were listening to decide if she deserved a second chance. They decided that she did. The grant was not a large amount of money by the standards of the people in that room, but it was enough. Enough to cut her hours at Harrington, enough to rent practice time at a studio, enough to begin again. She did not leave Harrington immediately. Her mother's situation had not changed, and the income still mattered, and Clara was the kind of person who does not walk away from things before it is the right time to walk away. But she began arriving to her shifts a little differently, with something in her posture that had not been there before, something that was less like weight and more like purpose. James the MAI circumflex TRED noticed it. He did not say anything about it directly, because he was not that kind of man. But on the last Friday evening that Clara worked the full dinner shift before her new schedule began, he did something that said what he could not quite put into words. He placed a small handwritten sign on top of the STEINWAY near the fireplace. It said reserved. There is a particular kind of courage that does not look like courage from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not come with a crowd cheering or a moment of obvious decision. It is the courage of a person who has set something precious aside for a long time, for good reasons, out of love and necessity, and who one evening, when a stranger with too much wine and too little thought makes a careless dare, quietly puts down a water pitcher, walks across a restaurant and sits down. It is the courage of someone who, after years of being invisible, decides to be seen. Not for him, not for the applause, not for the tip. For herself, for the music, for the girl who was 7 years old the first time she sat at a piano and understood, without having the words for it yet, that this was the thing, the one true thing that she was meant to do. Clara Mende played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor for a room full of strangers on a Friday evening in October. 8 minutes of music, 6 years of silence before it. Sometimes that is all it takes. One moment, one decision, one act of showing the world the truest version of who you are and trusting that the world, at least on that evening, will know what it is looking at.